Start your engines and drive the commissar closer because he wants to hit them with his sword. Let's talk about armoured behemoths sweeping enemy infantry before them, with a focused look at the new tank shock stratagem for Warhammer 40K 10th edition. Hello and welcome back to Auspex Tactics, where today I thought we'd take a look at one of the more interesting core stratagems that got revealed in that big leak the other week, the new rules of tank shock in Warhammer 40k, a bit of a return of a classic rule that we had in previous editions. Let's talk briefly about tank shock in the past, the trends that we've seen in vehicle melee in 10th edition, how powerful the stratagem is looking, and the potential slight weirdness that it might have going on with walkers. I think it would be a bit strange if Dreadnought shock was better than tank shock when the stratagem is called such. First up, tank shock isn't exactly a new thing to Warhammer 40k, though it is something that had gone away for a fair bit throughout 8th and 9th edition. They had rejigged the rules a few times throughout previous editions, but in general it tended to be a fairly fun and evocative rule: drive your big tank towards enemy infantry formations or ram them into enemy vehicles, and scatter the infantry out the way, as sometimes you don't really want to be standing in the way when a great big enemy armoured vehicle is bearing down on you. In 7th edition and prior, it was generally a way that you could move enemy infantry models out the way of yourself. If you moved the tank forward into their midst, the enemy unit would have to take a morale check or think about falling back. It wouldn't generally cause casualties unless there was literally no room for them to move out the way into, and there was quite a fun rule where one model could try death and glory if they wanted to, have one attack that automatically hit the tank, but if that attack didn't stop it in its tracks, then the infantry model would be crushed to death. There were also ramming rules in the past as well, usually having a single big attack on a vehicle that you contacted, with more power if you went at high speed or your vehicle was a particularly big and hefty one. Now it's reborn in a new flavour in the Leviathan book. The stratagem was leaked as part of the big rules reveal that we had the other week. We can talk about roughly how powerful it is, and also how Games Workshop might potentially have a misprint in the Leviathan book that might or might not get FAQ'd for that whole walkers thing. The way that tank shock works is basically to amp up vehicle melee when they charge into combat now, a mortal wound impact hits mechanic that works off their standard melee weapons like the Rhino's armoured tracks here. In 9th edition, the way that they did vehicle melee was typically hitting on 6s, maybe around about 3 to 6 highest strength attacks at AP 0 and damage 1. If you were hitting on 6s though, it basically meant that you'd very rarely actually inflict casualties. You might kill one light infantry model if you're lucky, but rarely more than that. Some exceptionally big vehicles actually weren't too bad in combat. Things like the Baneblade had some high strength AP-2 and damage 2 tread attacks. They could actually be surprisingly savage in combat, potentially killing a few Space Marines, or more if you use that Crush Them stratagem. In 10th edition, Games Workshop's previews have tended to focus either on battle line troops or on really big things, massive super heavies and faction leaders, but we have seen a few datasheets along the way that tell us the normal ways that vehicles will be fighting in combat now. Obviously, without really being built for it, they aren't exactly going to be setting the world on fire, but it looks like their tread attacks are actually decently more dangerous to enemy units now. This Rhino, for example, has 3 attacks hitting on a 4+, a strength 6 AP 0 and damage 1. At least it means that you're likely to average 1 or 2 hits on the enemy rather than 1 if you're very lucky. And then the Land Raider and Baneblade, being bigger beasties, they appear to have the same profile each. They both get 6 attacks hitting at strength 8, AP 0 and damage 1, and then again they hit on a 4+. For the Land Raider, that's a decent upgrade in the amount of damage that you might expect. For the Baneblade, it's a really big downgrade, seeing as it had the AP 2 and damage 2 before. In general, they're not going to be particularly exciting against anything saving on a 2+ or a 3+. You might credibly expect around about 1 or 2 light infantry killed though, depending on the vehicle size and how good their save is. The way that the tank shock stratagem works in 10th edition 40k is that you've got this core stratagem here. It's one command point to use, and it's basically mortal wound impact hits in your charge phase, and you'd also get to fight normally after that, presuming there's something left. It seems to be a very de-restricted core stratagem. It can affect literally any vehicle in the game, it would seem, and it really is quite a serious amp up to the melee capacities of the vehicles, as normally they'd just be killing 1 or 2 light infantry and be bad against high save things. Mortal wounds are pretty much the opposite of that, being excellent against high toughness, high save things. The mechanics for it are a bit odd, but seem to have been written with the vehicle melee profile in mind. You roll 1d6 per point of strength characteristic on the weapon that you've selected. For the Baneblades that'd be 8d6, or for the Rhino that'd be 6. Then on top of that you also get to add an extra 2d6 to those rolls if the strength characteristic of the weapon that you're attacking with exceeds the enemy's toughness. Say for example, if the Baneblade's strength 8 was targeting one of those Custodian's Terminators that's now toughness 7, he'd get to roll 10d6 against them rather than 8d6. Then you roll all of those dice together, and for each roll of a 5+, the target takes a mortal wound all the way up to a maximum of 6. Given that you're throwing quite so many dice at that, it's fairly likely to generate you at least some, and if you get very lucky, you could have a pretty devastating tank shock and it runs down a whole unit. Then if there's anything left, you'd still be able to get your normal attacks, maybe damage some light infantry, but probably not too much more. In terms of average damage expected, obviously it's quite swingy. For a Rhino with your 6 or 8d6, you'd either be expecting 2.7 mortal wounds on things that are toughness 5 or less, or 2 mortal wounds on average on a tougher target, say if you're ramming a big enemy tank. Either way, I'd say that the damage output for that is kind of okay for one command point. Obviously a lot better if you're targeting something that's not very tough compared with a tough thing when you're only getting the 6d6 rolls. Still though, for 1 CP it doesn't seem awful, potentially killing 3 1-wound infantry, or a Terminator with a little luck, or potentially crashing into an enemy big hitter that you've not quite managed to kill in the shooting phase, and potentially hoping for a mortal wound or two just to finish the thing off. For a Land Raider or Baneblade, the roll gets quite a bit better. Against things that are toughness 7 or less, you'd be averaging around about 3.3 mortal wounds, and against tougher targets, you'd be averaging around about 2.7. Despite getting the strength buff, I'd say that this isn't enormously more impressive than a Rhino, though it is obviously a little bit better, and you could apply the better version of it to more targets. Anything that's toughness 6 or toughness 7, you'll be a bit more efficient against compared with the Rhino. I guess the Baneblades and Land Raiders will actually have a little bit more meaningful melee as well, likely saving around about 2 or 3 AP0 wounds on lighter things at least. Obviously, this is pretty swingy. You could get loads of 5+s or you could get 0, so it's still going to be a risk and you can't guarantee that anything is going to die from this, but you can have a really good chance on lighter things. With command points being a bit more hard to come by than 10th edition, I would say that this is not going to be an auto-include thing every single time you can charge a unit, but I'd say it is enough damage to be meaningful, particularly situationally. If there was a tough enemy unit that just had a few wounds left, then this could give you a pretty reasonable chance of just killing them outright by having them run down with your tank. Tanks maybe don't need to be quite as fearful of being locked up in melee these days, as they can fire out of it with that -1 to hit, and I feel like against the right targets, provided it's something that didn't want to be in combat, then just the raw damage output could be useful enough to spend a CP on. Anything that pays a whole load of points for its wounds, like characters, or say tough Terminators with very high saves, they could be okay targets, obviously weighing up against how hard they're going to strike your tank back. Overall seems pretty fun, a meaningful damage boost and really quite evocative slamming your tank into the enemy army. I feel like it is a stratagem that is going to get used. However, as I mentioned at the start of the video, I feel like the weirdest bit out of this is that tank shock actually seems to be better on walkers and dreadnoughts at the moment, as opposed to the actual tanks. In a previous leak that we had for the stratagems, someone had claimed that it would be limited to non-walkers, and that kind of made sense to me, as I guess they're not really tanks, plus walkers can do the heroic intervention thing where non-walker vehicles can't. It genuinely does make me wonder if Games Workshop have a typo in their Leviathan book, something that might not manifest in the digital rules, and they might limit the stratagem to non-walkers only, but otherwise, if this is really what they intend, it does look like it's going to be most powerful when it applies to walkers and dreadnoughts charging in. Obviously, I'm not saying that those things shouldn't be better than vehicles in close combat, but typically they already have very good close combat weapons that can deal a whole ton of damage just by themselves. It just seems kind of strange that they'd get access to buckets of mortal wounds above tanks and vehicles, just because their weapons are already good already. If the stratagem doesn't get FAQ'd or changed at all for the digital rules, it looks like certain tanks and vehicles are going to be slamming home very hard indeed. The recently previewed Grey Knight's Dread Knight with the Demon Hammer, that one would usually be rolling 16d6, so around about 5 or 6 mortal wounds on average, a pretty decent chance to hit the cap there. Even an Armoured Warglaive will be averaging more than a Baneblade, with 4 mortal wounds on that one, and say an Imperial Knight with one of those Strength 20 fists, usually that'll mean that you're rolling 22d6, so you're going to be rolling over those 6 mortal wounds the majority of the time. 1 command point for 6 mortal wounds when a knight charges seems pretty brutal, particularly when on top of getting knight melee weapons, which are already representing their charges being brutal already. I'll be interested to hear your guys' takes on this. Do you think that this stratagem was really intended for walkers, or are we looking at a day 1 FAQ for the Leviathan book for this one, if walkers aren't truly intended to have the best tank shock? In any case, let me know your thoughts on the stratagem. Is the trade-off good enough to use it, or do you feel it's a bit situational? And let me know what you make of the walkers thing. Is it intended for them or not? If you've enjoyed the video, then feel free to subscribe to Auspex Tactics, or I'll certainly keep the regular 40k videos coming. I do tend to post new ones just about every day. Finally, if you have been enjoying all the videos on the channel, I would just like to mention that Auspex Tactics does have a Patreon page as well, and you can find that linked in the video description if you'd like to help support. Channel patrons do get a fair few advantages, including seeing certain videos early, regular votes to see what sort of things happen next on the channel, and automatic entry into the regular prize giveaways with a chance to win some big model kits each month. If any of that sounds good to you, or you'd just like to help support, the link is down in the video description. In any case, a massive thank you for listening, and I'll hope to see you guys next time.